Welcome to Spirits of Whiskey. We explore the wide world of whiskey through the many colorful personalities who make it, promote it, write about it, and more.
With each podcast, Kerry Moynihan, a certified bourbon steward and bartender, and yours truly, Philip Dobar, director of the Cocktail Collection, interview whiskey's most important names.
From high-profile makers, blenders, and ambassadors,
to out-of-the-way innovators and remote pioneers.
Join us as we discover the people and elements that give the water of life its spirit.
It is Whiskey Wednesday, June 16th, 2021, and you're listening to episode 46. Today we speak with Donal O'Gallachoir about Glendalough Distillery, located about an hour south of Dublin, Ireland.
But first, stay tuned for this week's Whiskey Chronicles. Hey, do you like whiskey, food, and adventure?
I do. Hi, I'm Kerry.
I'm Philip.
I'm Louise. I'm the chef.
Chef Louise Leonard, as in our World of Wheezy segment host here on the podcast. And Whiskey, a Chef's Journey. That chef.
That's right, the project that started this very podcast. The series stars our very own chef, Louise Leonard, winner of Emmy-winning The Taste on ABC.
And explores and connects the worlds of whiskey and food, city by city, country by country.
Would you like to see this spirited culinary adventure on a TV near you?
Well, you can by helping us finish the pilot episode through our crowdfunding campaign.
For more information, including behind-the-scenes photos, videos, and incentives,
and to make a pledge,
visit our website, whiskeyashefsjourney.com.
Or search for our campaign, Whiskey, a Chef's Journey, at GoFundMe.com. That's GoFundMe.com now.
Well, I think it's a cheers to that.
Let's. Cheers.
While preparing for this week's interview, we discovered the story of St. Kevin from a cocktail I had at Foreman's Tavern in Toluca Lake, California. The cocktail was called St. Kevin's Fire, so we decided St. Kevin's story would be the focus of this week's Whiskey Chronicles. However, during our interview with Donal, I asked him about the symbol on the Glendalough labels, and his answer led to the story of St. Kevin. Therefore, not only is Donal our guest in today's show, but he's also hosting this week's Whiskey Chronicles.
The person on the front of the label, the sort of rustic-looking character, is St. Kevin. And St. Kevin was born into nobility in Ireland. He turned his back on that, had this independent streak, went over the mountains doing some soul searching, looked down, seeing these two pristine lakes, the sort of bottom of a valley, beautiful glacial valley in Wicklow. He was drawn to them, said he became religious when he went in between them, and he built a civilization and isolation in the Wicklow Mountains. And it's actually monistic settlements like that of that era where the birthplace of distillation occurred. Where I was born and raised and where me and the other lads were from is literally a couple of miles away. So when we were talking about why don't we do something to bring back our heritage of distillation and do cool and interesting things for the category, we're like, well, sure, just down the road is where it all started. It's a beautiful area. It's also known as the City of the Seven Churches. Over 1 million people go there every year. It's absolutely fascinating. And there's lots of stories around St. Kevin, around St. Kevin and St. Patrick. And there's this sort of folklore / mystery around it. The story that's depicted on the front of our bottles is St. Kevin and the Blackbird. So it's said, and we don't know how true this is, but we lean towards it definitely happened. But it's said that he used to pray up to his waist in ice cold water with his hands upstretched towards the heavens. It's said that he was very harmonious, very at one with nature. A blackbird flew down and landed into his hand. The blackbird was so at peace when she landed there. She laid her eggs, and St. Kevin stood like that for 2 weeks until the hatchlings hatched, as they're known to do.
Breaking news. Just this week, the Distilled Spirits Council, a trade association representing makers of distilled spirits sold in the United States, announced a 5-year suspension of tariffs levied by the European Union and the US. The suspension is a happy byproduct of an agreement to end the two trading partners' nearly 20-year-old dispute over aircraft subsidies. The deal will lift the EU's 25% tariff on US rum, brandy, and vodka, as well as the 25% US tariff on liqueurs and cordials from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Spain, and on some, although not all, brandies from France and Germany. However, the 25% tariff on American whiskey levied by the EU and United Kingdom tariff stemming from a steel and aluminum trade dispute dating to the Trump presidential administration will stand, at least for now. According to Katie Labosco, reporting for CNN, untold cases of whiskey are sitting in American distilleries and warehouses just waiting to be shipped abroad. But because the Biden presidential administration hasn't moved to end certain trade disputes that started during the Trump presidential administration, none of it will be going to thirsty customers overseas. The reason? Tariffs have rendered many American whiskeys just too expensive for most European whiskey drinkers. For more information, please visit spiritsofwhiskey.com for complete show notes, including links to further reporting on this developing story.
To learn more about the St. Kevin's Fire cocktail I had, or to watch our Kindred Spirits videos about Glendalough Irish whiskey, log into your VIP account on our website where you can see all the extra content. Up next, we'll hear more from Donal about his whiskey journey and Glendalough Irish whiskey. Stay with us.
Spirits of Whiskey explores the wide world of whiskey through high-profile and out-of-the-way makers, blenders, writers, ambassadors, innovators, and pioneers. And we've been traveling the world virtually to bring these people and their whiskey journeys to you. We realize just how many great stories we've put aside to share with you at a later date. And that date is here. Spirits of Whiskey is offering access to its new VIP content page to loyal listeners and whiskey lovers who want more. And when it comes to whiskey, who doesn't want more? For as little as 99 cents a month, you can have access to videos related to topics discussed on past podcasts, as well as our new series, The Malting Floor. Sign up now to become a supporter at anchor.fm/spirits-of-whiskey. That's whiskey with an E. Click on the support button and select the contribution level that's right for you. Once you've submitted your payment information, just visit our website, spiritsofwhiskey.com, to create your personal VIP access account. We can't wait to see you in the VIP lounge. Join us. Today on Spirits of Whiskey, we're very fortunate to have with us Mr. Donal O'Gallachoir, brand manager and co-founder of Glendalough Distillery, makers of Glendalough Irish whiskey in County Wicklow, Ireland. Welcome, Donal.
Yes, welcome.
Perfect. Absolute pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for having me. Love being able to share some of our stories, some of our whiskey, of course, some of our wild gins. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Well, as we always start out with the show, we always ask our guests what their whiskey journey is. So as a wee little lad in Ireland, did you see yourself working and or starting up this kind of a company? Or did you see yourself as a train engineer or a, doctor, lawyer, something?
Astronaut.
Yes. And how did you get from a wee little lad in Ireland to now promoting this in Chicago?
Good stuff, yeah. So I think originally growing up as a wee lad, I didn't really have sort of much time for school. I wanted to actually be a fireman for most of it. And then I realized that it was very hard to get into the fire brigade in Ireland. And I started working in construction and in the summers and doing a long-winded thing here. But anyway, when I was about 17, I was still in high school and I looked at this job and there's a job for promotions and essentially running promotions, whether it's alcohol promotions, whether it was Murphy Stout, it was Jameson, it was Napo Castle, it was like certain like vodka brands and Bulmer cider. So I got my start at 17 before I was legally able to drink. And I started doing promos, these alcohol promos, whether it was like for, I think one was with Napo Castle when they were sponsoring the Irish Open and all that. And I fell in love with it. I had no problem, as always, going up to people and talking to them and telling them about it. And people loved hearing about that, especially if they're getting a drink about it. They were into it. And so I was good at that. And I started managing teams when they were activating me and being brought into these suppliers with these nice offices and, with like Pernod Ricard and stuff like that. And then I realized that, if I wanted to get into this business, I probably had to focus at school. So I put my head down. I went to university, and after university, I got with an independent bottler that was just making waves in the US. It's now a distillery. And I was dropped into Atlanta, Georgia with just go and do. And I sort of learned the business from the ground up from there, like staff trainings, how to talk about it, how to deal with the distributor, how to talk to a distributor in a sales meeting, how to talk to bars, how to get things going. So I built up that state that they were doing 300 cases to 3,500 cases. And then we actually launched that brand and their portfolio nationally with a national importer. And all the while, I was actually speaking with my cousin Barry, who was also in the drinks industry, but from a more sort of research side. And we kept on talking, and we used to meet up with the other crew that we ended up all coming together on the distillery. And it was sort of two things. It was, we seen firsthand what was going on in the US, where there is this sort of rising tide of these new distilleries that were looking at their own sort of heritage, where there's the resurgence of rye in like Maryland and different areas when they had their own history.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah, 100%. And the Pennsylvanian rye and all that. Where people were looking at wheated bourbons and say, this back in the day, people used to make this. And there's very early ages of the sort of craft distilling revival. I thought that was fascinating. And then secondly was that we were all into Irish whiskey, and had been for many, many years. And we used to meet up for pints and drink whiskey and talk about it. If you work in Irish whiskey, you know this, and everyone's probably heard this. Like, we used to rule, like, the birthplace of distillation goes back to these old monastic settlements in Ireland. So we invented, like, whiskey. At our height, we ruled the world with whiskey through a couple of different events, and we could get into it. But wars, prohibitions, all that.
It's apologizing for prohibition.
Yeah.
Europe actually led the way on temperance. We just kind of followed. And as Americans do, we tend to go over the top with these political movements.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's a couple of things back by back. But my point being is we knew our own heritage, and it's like, well, why the hell aren't we doing something like this for our own? Sure, places like just down the road from us, like Glendalough, is where the birthplace of distillation occurred. So that's sort of how we got into it. And then I moved back home from Atlanta, and we sort of begged, borrowed, and stole. We didn't steal, but begged, borrowed, and stole to set up a small craft distillery in County Wicklow, where I'm from. I'm a local boy there, and that's coming on about 10 years ago now. So, yeah.
Wow. Did you start distilling whiskey from the get-go?
Not from the get-go. We were distilling poitín, and then we were sourcing and contracting, distilling some whiskey, and then distilling gin, and now distilling whiskey as well. So it's always been a bit of a process with us, because we started with a very small investment level. Mm-hmm. We pretty went to rich people we knew, or people that had a bit of money, and said, look, we have this idea. We think it's going to work. There's like 3 distilleries in Ireland. Like, look what's happening in the States. We can do this. We can tell a story around this. There's such room to do interesting stuff here.
Right.
So we always started at a very small level, and it was always part of our goal to sort of bit by bit, stage by stage expand. Mm-hmm. And right now we're in 44 different countries.
That's awesome.
I got the recent IRI data, and we're now the fastest growing Irish whiskey brand / distillery in the US.
Wow.
How many US states?
We are in 22 states, coast to coast, most major metros.
Okay. Very good. Very
Almost
good.
half. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Are you at liberty to divulge the brand, the sales of which you helped grow?
Oh, yeah, of course. It's Bernard Walsh's portfolio. So he had the Irishman, Writer's Tears, Walsh Whiskey. Mm-hmm. He also has a great Irish cream as well, which is absolutely phenomenal stuff. Yeah, I have a great relationship with Bernard. He gave me my start, and I worked with him for 2 years and learned the business from the ground up.
Yeah, I think we know all of those whiskeys. Wonderful stuff. Yeah.
So what year did you guys start the distillery, and how long did it take to go from conception to actually getting your first bottled, whether it was a distilled one that you did or a sourced one that you did?
So we were talking about it in 2011. We were founded in 2012. By the end of 2013, we had our property in Newtown. Yeah, so that's the sort of avenue. And in 2013, I moved back to Ireland. And actually, before that, I moved back to Ireland. But in 2013, we launched with poitín. Just poitín. Okay. That was the first thing that was from the distillery. And
the Glendalough new make.
Yes, to a degree. There is difference from poitín to new make. And, you can use things like crab apples and sugar beet within a mash of poitín. So, and it actually dates back to 584 AD, mm-hmm. a precursor to whiskey. It's what whiskey evolved from, is a very good way to say it. Another way to say it would be what mezcal is to tequila, poitín is to Irish whiskey.
Mm-hmm. Or gin is to Geneva.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, very much so. It's the origin of whiskey.
Or Geneva is to gin, rather.
Yeah, vice versa.
Right.
Right.
Geneva being the origin, yes.
So let's talk a little bit about the poitíns. It says mountain strength. So what's the difference between mountain strength and not mountain strength?
We used to have 3 poitíns.
Huh.
We used to have one at a 40% ABV, so 80 proof. We used to have one that was sherry cask aged. That was actually a haunt back to this famous distiller, sort of back in the day up near Bushmills in Rockshark and County Antrim, I digress. And then we had one, because poitín always had a reputation of being slightly higher proof. So, and then where we are and where Glendalough is in the Wicklow Mountains. So we released one that was mountain strength. And then increasingly, as poitín became sort of less of what we do and what we're about, we just wanted to keep the one that was mountain strength.
Okay, now tell me, what is this one? Are you allowed to tell us what the grain mash bill is for this bad boy?
Of course, yeah. So this is going to be 100% malted barley, this mash bill here.
Okay.
And it is going to be double distilled. And it's off distill in the sort of about 63 and change. So only a drop of water, because we like round numbers. We have it at the 60%, 120 proof.
That is darn good.
Any botanicals in the mix?
No botanicals in our poitín. There is producers that are doing some really cool stuff with incorporating botanicals and incorporating, what was one I heard? Honeycomb.
Oh.
And even incorporating honey within the distillate. There's historic recipes of crab apples being used within the mash. Like barley's always has been and always will be, well, I won't say that.
Should always.
But barley traditionally has always been king in terms of distillation within Ireland, within Pottsville, within single malt, within poitín. And Philip, we spoke about it briefly. A lot of the Scots-Irish people in Scotland, people in Ireland that emigrated in the 1600s to the US, they went down the Appalachian Trail. They weren't sort of allowed in these more sort of Presbyterian, Lutheran, what have you, towns.
Indeed.
And they had this distilling background from distilling poitín, and they started not being able to get barley, and they could get corn, they could get rye, and that's where you get your moonshiners from. That's also where you get some of your brands like Old Fitzgerald and these sort of historic bourbon brands that typically have some Irish names to them.
Right. Now, what I think is interesting is for a clear spirit, it's got a lot of really good legs on it.
It's weighty, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they put a hang there. And that speaks to Pottsville distillation, but also speaks to barley itself. You can see it actually stays there in the glass. And it doesn't taste like, on the nose rather, I'd probably go with the first. You don't get that, like, that harshness going to blow the head off you, straight off the still, straight out of the cask strength type of stuff. It's a bit more subdued. Like, heat is definitely there on the back end, but you don't really get it. It has this sort of bready, biscuity, almost doughy quality in the nose for me.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely.
I could sniff on this all day and not burn my nose.
I like the texture makes a mark in the mid palate that it just sort of sits there a little bit. I'd love to talk about the history of poitín.
Please.
But it's sort of wrapped into, obviously, Irish whiskey and some of the whiskeys we tried here. So sort of timeline of events is the Irish monks were traveling around societies to societies in either the 6th century, the following couple of hundred years. And they came across the art form of distillation in Greece, where they were distilling for aroma and perfume. So they used to scribe down different technological advances, farming techniques, what have you. They brought that back to Ireland and they started to distill it, essentially distill beer, because beer was sacred within these monks. And yeah, they started to get a taste for it. They called it Ishkabaha, which was anglicized when the English came into Ishki, then whiskey, which probably a lot of people know already. And then the term poitín came for it because it comes from the apparatus a pot still used. A pot still in Gaelic or in Irish is called putta. Poitín means what comes off a pot still. So it's essentially in that sort of flowery Irish language. It's give us a drop of what comes off the pot still type of thing. And from that point in this, let's call it the 6th century, it sort of creeped out of these monastic settlements, became more of a agricultural pursuit where people would distill excess grains. They would essentially distill it, they would trade it, they would drink it, they would do whatever. Where it changes is when in the 1500s, the English come in the Tudors' conquest of Ireland, and they essentially start building up towns and smaller cities and, sort of make their mark on the island. And they start getting a taste for what all these locals are drinking, whether it's poitín or Ishkabaha. There was also words of aquavit around it, which was sort of interchangeable. And then the English started to tax it like they're known to do, which is always a running theme through everything I'm going to talk about is how the English taxed Irish whiskey. And yeah, it gets to a point where there's all these sort of laws brought in and people evading them and what have you. And it gets to a point in 1661 on Christmas Day where King Charles II makes all distillation illegal, because he did it on Christmas Day because he's a bit of a bastard, to be honest. And this created a rift in how whiskey was distilled. Your bigger distilleries in your towns and cities that were set up, there were bigger operations. They got grants to distill from the English, and they essentially go big or go home. They ramped up, they started to age, they started with the fortified wines and, started to source casks in and all that. But your poitín distillers in rural Ireland wanted nothing to do with it. So they kept on distilling in this very ancient way. Hand-built pot stills, soaking barley for a day and a night, essentially smoking it in houses as well, grinding it down by hand, cut points by taste, by smell. And there were certain regions of Ireland that were, and to a degree, are still famous to this day. The English tried to put down the illicit distilling industry within Ireland for many, many years. And they used to put community fines on if they found a pot still in your township, the whole town would be fined.
Wow.
There's like these sort of vicious cat and mouse games, and there's, areas of Ireland that declared themselves republics just over illicit distillation. It was the only revenue stream for certain areas. It was the only way they could make a living. And it was always on your reputation. It was on your family name, to like essentially how you did it, how you went out there. And there was this, a lot of folklore around it. You used to rub it on your hands if you had arthritis. You used to rub it on greyhounds before races. You used to rub it on horses. When you're distilling, you used to put a drop on the ground for the fairies, because there's a lot of superstition around that, and especially around that time in Ireland.
You could rub it on your tongue in glassfuls and swallow it.
There you go. There you go. When Irish whiskey was at its height, in the late 17 into 1800s, it was estimated that there was 200 large distilleries on the island of Ireland. But there's estimated to be 1,800 illicit poitín stills in the island.
Wow.
Poitín outsold, and for a certain period of time was considered higher quality than the larger distilleries, and it was the common man's whiskey. And there's this depth of heritage, and sometimes it gets a bad rap. People call it moonshine or firewater or whatever, but it got a bad rap in like the 60s, 70s, when there's a sort of cheap available bottled gas. So people wouldn't have to do it by fire as much. And then there's availability of sugar and just cheaper materials that they could use. And so they wouldn't make it out of barley. They'd essentially make it out of sugar water, make it as high octane as they could. That was the unscrupulous sort of side of it. But also the younger generation of these very, very traditional poitín distillers had no interest in staying in rural Ireland, making illicit poitín under, like, evading the law, a couple of pounds for a few pints on a weekend. Or they could go to London or New York or Boston or Chicago or Australia or whatever. So it got a bit of a bad rap then, but, in its essence, it dates back to the first spirit ever distilled.
Right.
It is the forefather of whiskey. It's what all whiskeys come from. It's what all moonshiners, and it's if you put this on a back bar, like every bottle on the back bar owes itself to that. Every bottle in a liquor store owes itself to poitín.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's a brief historical sidebar here that I think is germane. Taxation and the history of taxation and the history of spirits innovation are inextricably linked. You were talking about the illicit distilling of poitín. Spanish taxation is responsible for the rise of mezcal production in Mexico, pisco production on the west coast of South America. Yeah, because they were taxing winemaking.
Right.
Okay, we'll make brandy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Funny how that goes.
Back to the beautiful spirits that you guys have. So after your poutines, I keep saying this wrong. How do you say it? Poutine?
Poitín.
Poitín.
See, we knew this was going to happen, so we wrote it phonetically on it.
Oh, you sure did?
Yeah.
Okay, so your poitín, that was the first thing that you had off the still. And then what was the next thing that you had coming off or that you produced after sourcing?
Well, a couple of aged single malts that are discontinued and sold out for us, a 7-year and a 13-year single cask, single malt. We managed to secure interesting parcels of whiskey from a distillery that was about to be purchased that wouldn't have been released by themselves. And we were able to just release them out like that. These things would have been sort of gobbled up into...
Was that Cooley by any chance?
Yeah, it was Cooley, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we managed to get these interesting parcels of whiskey, and at the time, an Irish single malt, 7 years, from like just here's your single cask, single malt. That wasn't a thing that was really out there that much at all.
Right.
It was actually like, it was somewhat innovative, and it's like, that isn't innovative right now. Like, it's 2.0 going on 3.0 on the island of Ireland, which is great to see. But when we set up, there was like 3 large distilleries. That was it.
Yeah.
And the majority of Irish whiskey was blended, was seen as light and sweet, was typically drank in a shot or as mixed drink.
Yep.
Like, Irish whiskey was overlooked by the whiskey community, by whiskey drinkers, especially internationally, even though there is such wealth of different styles and flavor profiles historically, and then all this white space in terms of things that people haven't done. And, a big thing for us setting up is we wanted to do that. We wanted to make remarkably different Irish whiskies that sort of stood out.
Right.
And if you map out all of our whiskies versus everything else, they're all off on these islands all by themselves.
Right. Now, those 3 big makers, presumably at the time there were Bushmills, Cooley, and Irish Distillers Limited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. But now there are many dozens of Irish whiskey distilleries either already making or in the planning stage.
Mm-hmm.
You were in the very first wave of new distilleries.
We like to say, we were part of the rising tide of new distilleries.
Mm-hmm.
We really feel, and I don't think it's too bad to say, or much of a jump to say, that we were at the forefront of the Irish whiskey distillery, Irish whiskey revival.
Absolutely.
Because when 95-ish% of Irish whiskey was blended, and all of it is at a certain price point, we said we're not going to do a blend. We're not going to do a blend ever. Everything's going to be barrel by barrel aged, non-chill filtered, and in this flavor profile that no one is familiar with within Irish whiskey.
That's awesome.
And everyone thought, that's never going to work.
What? Of course it's going to work.
You went to a liquor store in the US, which was the biggest market, still is the biggest market for Irish whiskey. And you've seen 3 big brands there. You've seen some stuff below it. You might see 1 or 2 above it, but that was it. When I worked in Atlanta for Bernard Walsh, there's 2 bottles in most store, and it was entry-level Jameson, entry-level Bushmills.
Yeah.
And we thought that was a bit of a tragedy, given the history and given what other people were doing for their own heritage.
Right.
But,
Given that in the 19th century, it was the world's best-selling whiskey, Irish whiskey.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
3-1 to Scotch as well in Britain.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated by the history of Irish whiskey, and it always makes me so sad when the U.S. Prohibition had such a big part in its demise. But
that was the last nail on the coffin, but there was also our War of Independence. So, so there's all this domestic turmoil, our Civil War, which, we didn't get enough in the War of Independence. We decided to have another one.
Right. Yeah, you had to have a second one, right? Yeah.
Let's move on.
Yes, let's go to the next one here.
Yeah. This was a release, and I think it's had a couple of different iterations. But this was our first whiskey that I think we sort of nailed. This is a double barrel aged single grain. And single grain whiskey has a great history. It has Irish roots, and it actually has Irish roots that are wrapped up with poitín. So Aeneas Coffey of the Coffey Still used to be a British tax agent in Ireland and used to be tasked with putting poitín distillers out of business. And he has a lot of harrowing accounts of these cat and mouse games and these vicious sort of fights that they had. They got up in front of the Parliament in Ireland and sort of said, like, this is crazy, what's going on? Anyway, he became fascinated with how they were distilling. And he thought it was extremely inefficient, that they're hand-built pot stills, that they're doing everything by smell, by taste, that they had an open fire, and they're like, they're keeping their temperature sort of by eye. And he sort of became fascinated with that, and he developed a new kind of still. So he was very humble and shit like that. So he called it after himself, Coffey Still, Coffey. Yeah. And then he went around Ireland and tried to flog it to these distilleries. And people said, yeah, no chance. No chance at all. We know your background. You probably have relations in rural Ireland that you've been trying to put out of business.
Right.
We won't have any of that. And then like single grain whiskey is the backbone of the blends in Scotland, which essentially, took Irish whiskey's place in the 1900s. Like this style of whiskey has become very popularized within Japanese whiskey with your Nika coffee grain and coffee malt. But it was completely somewhat overlooked within Irish whiskey outside of the blends. And we thought this was a beautiful style that's light and bright, and it's all about the characteristics of the cask. So what we wanted to do with this is we wanted to layer on a sweetness. So it's called double barrel, so hence there's 2 barrels. So we wanted to layer on the sweetness because a lot of people think Irish whiskey is sweet, also bourbon's sweet. So we want to make this appeal to it. So it's initially aged for 3 years, 3 months in a first fill bourbon cask from Wild Turkey, char level number 4. So this layers on that beautiful like butterscotch, toffee, vanilla, that typical sweeter bourbon cask note. And then we transfer it over to another first fill barrel from Montilla in Spain. So Oloroso sherry.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
The goal of the sherry cask, and you don't see younger whiskeys. This is 4 years old, so it's an extra 9 months in the Oloroso sherry. You don't see younger whiskeys, or you don't see light whiskeys being aged in sherry casks that often. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to add a complexity. We wanted to add a finish to it. We wanted to add that tannin note, but also that sort of cherry, fig, cranberry. We wanted to add that note. So we actually jokingly call this a gateway Irish whiskey for that very reason.
Nice.
So it has all of this initial light, sweetness, typical notes. Then it gets very atypical, and it gets this sherry cask complexity.
Mm-hmm.
People go, what am I tasting? I didn't know Irish whiskey could taste like that. Tell me more.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's that conversation starter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And additionally, as I said previously, it's barrel by barrel aged. So it goes from bourbon cask into Oloroso sherry cask, brought down at 42% and non-chill filter.
It is.
It's delicious.
It is very delicious. I can taste a little bit of the poitín like flavor underneath it, I feel like.
It has a little bit of a malt comes through in the nose and on the front.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mixed mash bill of malted barley and organic corn.
Okay.
So it's a single grain that has 2 grains. So in your classifications of Irish whiskey, single grain is like single malt, single distillery malt whiskey, single grain, single distillery grain whiskey off a coffee still.
Mm-hmm.
You could have a 4 grain single grain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They just like to confuse people. They really do. I mean, I get it. But I mean, a lot of people that are just starting out are like, what?
Oh, there's a 4-grain Canadian. We were interviewing Don Livermore of Hiram Walker recently, and Gooderham and Warts, 4-grain.
I know 4 grain's been big in within bourbon. I'm thinking of E.H. Taylor do a 4 grain. I think there's a couple other people that do a 4 grain, which is interesting.
So before we get too much further into the lovely spirits here, I still wanted to know a little bit more about your particular journey. So when you got with your cousin, how did you guys decide? How many owners do you have? 6, is it? 5?
It's 5 of us.
5
of us that started.
So who thought of it first, and who approached who to become the 5 of you?
Well, so my cousin Barry was he worked looking at the drinks industry. So he was like a researcher. He worked with a guy, a friend of his called Brian. So those two were sort of talking around it. And then he was asking questions from me in terms of like the Irish whiskey market there, the craft distilling market. And we were just sort of talking every, sort of month or so. And then there was a childhood friend. I think you need a map for all of this. There's a childhood friend of Barry's called Gary. And then it was his mutual friend with other people called Kevin. So anyway, everyone had like sort of different...
St. Kevin?
St. Kevin.
Yeah, St. Kevin was gone a while, it was sort of past his day.
But did Kevin have anything to do with choosing St. Kevin for the bottle?
Yeah, he would have, yeah. He would have been a strong supporter of that idea, all right, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's my whiskey.
Yeah. But in any case, we met up a couple of times for like pints, and we got on very well. And we were drinking whiskey and pints is like around Christmas time for like a couple of years, and we just sort of went after it from there, and it sort of went quickly from there. Yeah, so it was friends and family that's what we sort of said. It's a friends and family distillery, and we roped in a load of extended family members. So my uncle used to run a sales route for us in Dublin, used to look after a couple of the liquor stores, as you used to call them, off licenses, as they call them back home. 2 of my brothers and my sister-in-law, Natalia, used to help out on the bottling line whenever we were short-handed, and used to just give a hand. Yeah, and then one of my colleagues now in the US is a cousin of one of the guys, and just it was all hands on deck. And a lot of people are still around within the distillery, and as we grow and all that. So
then how did you end up in Chicago and being the face in America?
I don't know. Well, I suppose I had a variety of different roles.
Also a lot of experience working in this market, in the US market, yes?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And it's a big focus market for us. So sort of how that came about is I originally self-distributed, which was a pain, and you have to go to people and you have to sell it to them, and then you have to collect money off them,
Right.
and then you have to sell it to them again.
Right.
It's like having a newspaper route.
There's business. It used to be having a newspaper route and a debt collector's business at the same time. So
Right.
we did that, and then we were sort of begging distributors to take us in Europe. So that's run like export market. And then we signed with an importer in the US, and I moved over here to sort of run that. And there was one market, which was Massachusetts, which a big Irish whiskey market. But everyone's told us we shouldn't go there because a certain brand had it all wrapped up.
Jameson.
And then I grew that. We don't talk about other whiskeys. We only talk about other whiskeys. But then we grew that very successfully. We're number 3 Irish whiskey within the state of Massachusetts still to this day.
Great.
Which is crazy, which is beating out, big multinationals. And then we started to expand, and I started to work with that and visiting those markets and all that. And then we have a new importer going back probably a couple of years, and a strategic partner, and they're headquartered in Chicago. And, the sort of ask was to come over here and help as we grow it out. And we launched California, and then launching Washington State and all that. And then COVID hit. So now this is where I am.
This is where you are.
So that's it. So I've had a variety of different roles.
Yeah.
And how do you like Chicago?
I like Chicago a lot. It's a great food and drinking scene, and there's great craft cocktails, great outdoor spaces, and it really feels like it's opening up, and people are just, and a lot of the restaurants have taken over the area in front of their establishment,
Right.
for outdoor meetings, and it's almost like big areas of the city are pedestrianized. So it's it's very much
That's happening here too.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a good feeling around it. Yeah.
Yeah. Los Angeles, a lot of cities, there are historically regulations against sidewalk dining.
Yeah.
It's very anti-European, if you will.
Everywhere. Yeah.
Where sidewalk dining is, it's a thing. It's part of the culture. In many U.S. cities, it's not. But the pandemic has changed that. I know Los Angeles had regulations against it. And now the mayor is saying, I have every intention of maintaining this going forward. So I think that's going to happen in a lot of U.S. cities. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Oh, it's going to be fantastic. And it gives people options as well.
Right.
Especially, if it's flu season or there's a second go around or outbreaks, whatever, it's safer to be outside.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
indeed, look, the flu was in utter abeyance this year because people were masked and not shaking hands. And everything they were doing to avoid COVID infection are the same things one should do to avoid the flu.
Yeah. So it's funny how that goes, isn't it?
Yeah. And another thing that I like to have when I'm having a flu is a hot toddy, which I make with whiskey. So let's get on to this next one, the pot still. Let's talk the pot still.
Pot still. From pot
I love this
pot
pot still. This is a project we've been working on for about 6 years. This is a completely different kettle of fish in relation to the double barrel. They could not be further apart.
Exactly.
So what I'd probably start with is the whiskey itself. So this is a pot still whiskey. So pot still whiskey is the defining point within Irish whiskey. It's a style that can only be made on the island of Ireland. It's geographically protected. And like everything within Irish whiskey, that it all came about by the English. So in the 1700s, Irish single malts were dominant, and that's what people were producing. That's what they were aging in these rare prize cask, Sherry Madeira casks. That's what they were shipping out to the world. The distilleries were very good at evading tax. Barrels would go missing and things would be misreported and all of that type of thing. And one of these
fell off the lorry.
Yeah, all that type of stuff.
Fell off the lorry, broke in the street.
But in any case, they introduced a tax that had knock-on effects. So they introduced a malt tax in 1785, and this malt tax led innovative distillers to start utilizing unmalted barley because malted barley was taxed extremely heavily. So this enabled them to start messing around with the mash bill, barley being key, but using unmalted barley, which is also known as green barley, in the mash with malted barley. And they said it was the purest thing that ever came to them. Pot still, they call it pure pot still whiskey or single pot still whiskey or Irish pot still whiskey. A new style of whiskey was born in the late 1700s. It became really, as I said, the defining point in Irish whiskey. That style absolutely took off. And throughout the 1800s, right up until the early 1900s, pot still whiskey was Irish whiskey. It's estimated that 8 out of 10 bottles of whiskey that were drank globally were pot still whiskey. And pot still whiskey, it's renowned for two sort of key characteristics. It's renowned for its texture. It's big, it's oily, it's robust. You know, it's often said there's eating and drinking in a glass of pot still. And this is because the addition of that green barley is oily. It's oily in the mash. It's oily before distillation. It's oily after distillation. Then anyway, the second thing is it has this sort of tangy underlayer of a spice. And they call it like a pot still characteristic. So us being us, we're fascinated with pot still whiskey. Everyone in Irish whiskey loves pot still whiskey. It's what's going to be the sort of new wave going forward. So what this is a triple distilled pot still whiskey. It's 2/3 unmalted barley, 1/3 malted barley. That's only where the story starts with this. It's a single cask offering. We sustainably felled 14 trees in the Wicklow Mountains, just around the distillery. And we work with a very cool forestry up there and a guy called Paddy Piercer. But those 14 trees yielded 50 casks.
Is that what this is a symbol of?
It's all traceable back to the tree. So if you actually type in the bottle, the tree you have, the cask, the batch, the bottle, all of those notations on the front into that link on the website, it's going to show you a video of how we chose that tree, how we brought it down, halved it, quartered, staved it, how we built the barrel, how we toasted the barrel, how we filled it with whiskey, and how we took it back. So
that's awesome.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I have tree number 4.
I am also tree number 4.
I am tree number 8. But in any case, so true traceability right back to the tree. So from bottle back to the tree, which is really cool. For every tree that we take down, we actually plant 7 more in the Wicklow Mountains. And to this day, we've actually put over 1,000 of indigenous Irish trees into the Wicklow Mountains. And we actually just won an Icon of Whiskey Award for the most sustainable distillery on the island of Ireland.
That's awesome.
I'm actually going to get to the best bit now.
Wonderful.
Oh, I can't wait.
The trees themselves are a rare native breed of Irish oak called Glendalough that used to have 90% coverage on the island of Ireland. Now it's 0.02%.
Oh, wow.
So this is through shipbuilding from the English. There we go. An invasive species coming in. Essentially, it was almost cleared out. And then these invasive beech trees came up. And so we are very lucky where we are that some of the only remaining Irish oak trees are in mountainous regions. I don't know, manor houses. We're next to both. The breed itself is extremely fast growing.
Okay.
Oh, that's good.
It has thinner cell walls. So it's very, very porous. You get this deeper interaction with the actual whiskey itself. And it yields into this weird flavor profile. One is like this sort of sticky toffee pudding, this like rich sweetness, almost molassesy maple syrup quality. And then the second one has this sort of deeper tannin, like almost herbaceous, sort of leafy tree bark element to it. And we went around the world looking at different breeds of oak and doing sort of mad stuff with Mizunara and all this type of thing. But it sort of brought us back home when we learned more and more about our own indigenous oak. And we thought it was only right that Irish whiskey was aged in Irish oak, specifically this style. And it leans into a flavor profile that went by the wayside. Because, and a bit, this is not much of a jump, but if you think we've been distilling on the island of Ireland from the 6th century, we used to have 90% coverage on the island of Ireland of this indigenous oak tree, and people used to store stuff in barrels. So it's not much of a jump to say people aged their spirit, whether it's poitín and mixed mash bills, what have you, in our own indigenous oak.
Right.
And there was a flavor element that was put to it, but because of factors of history, but this is a flavor profile, like a terroir-driven flavor profile that went by the wayside. And I love this whiskey, and I'm so proud of this because it celebrates and also protects that. So it celebrates that flavor profile and then sets it up for the future.
Indeed.
So
here's a distribution question for you. We have both of the whiskeys, the poitín and the 2 gins. Are these all available in all the states that you said you were distributing in?
Yeah. They're all in all the states.
22 states, okay.
We have good distribution. We're always working on more. We are available through the great people. So I know you're in California, so K&L or Mission. And then nationally, we are available through Reserve Bar, who ship to nearly every state.
Yeah.
So not quite every state. I think there's, I'm not sure if they do Alaska, Hawaii, but they do everywhere like 40 something states. So even if you're in a state that doesn't have distribution, you're actually able to get our stuff, and they've been great with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love Reserve Bar. They're awesome.
Back to the oak for a moment. In season 1, we've interviewed Matt Hoffman.
I know, yeah.
Distiller at Westland Distillery in Seattle.
You know Matt?
Yeah, I met him a couple of times this is BC before COVID.
Right.
At all the whiskey shows.
Yes.
And then I have a friend who, his name's Chris Rabick, and he works with Westland and has been with Westland for a good amount of time.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we love what they do.
Yeah. So Matt ages some of his whiskey in Gariana oak, Quercus gariana, which is native to the Pacific Northwest of North America. And it grows in a very, very long, but very narrow, well, not terribly long, but very narrow strip. And that's it.
Yeah.
They age some of the oak in it, and it's
a protected species.
It's a protected species. So really all they can use
is the dead trees that fall down. So I wanted to ask, similarly, do you guys have any restrictions with your type of tree, or is it, anybody can use it, or is it endangered at all, considering?
There's no real restrictions. There's just not a huge amount of availability, and there's not a lot of access to it, I suppose. And again, we're very lucky with where we are. And in terms of our true sustainability, every tree we plant is fully protected and will never be chopped down.
Wow.
So
do you not plant any for yourself for later use?
We have ones that we've selected that we want to continue to use, but we'll only choose older trees. So typically how we do it, it's in this thing that I always mess up saying. It's continuous forest coverage management systems, which needs an acronym or something like that, right? But the way we'll actually choose these trees is we go into the woods, so we work with a forester there, and we select these older trees that are more at risk to actually fall down and damage other trees. We'll select them in areas 2-3 at a time to develop a clearing so we can actually replant in that area and it'll repopulate with the younger trees. So in that way, you're actually setting up the forest for success. So you're never actually clearing it out.
Right.
So our goal is to continuously get the older trees. I think we'll have a very lucky problem to have if it's 80 years down the line with the distillery. I'll be passed away by then, and they can't have that are of age to be taken down. So
how old are the trees typically that you do chop down?
80 years old to about 120.
Oh wow.
Is typically what we're looking for, which are they're majestic, and it's beautiful to be able to put the characteristic.
Have you tried a younger tree to see if the flavor profile is vastly different?
We haven't. No, we haven't.
Okay. Just a thought.
On the trees, which is actually fascinating, is we don't actually have a cooperage at the distillery as of yet. So we actually fell these trees and then we actually shipped them to Montilla in Spain. And they'll actually dry age them for a year in the climate there in order to prep the wood.
Right.
And then we'll actually build the barrels, use and lightly toast them with leftover oak. So there's no fuel source that's actually interacting. And all of that is just to get the oak seasoned to the best possibility to actually lean into the flavor profile.
That's awesome.
Right. I have a question. In the U.S., at least, your Glendalough is in the Mark Anthony portfolio. Are there synergies that you're able to capture within that family of spirits, like ex-bourbon casks and the like?
I'm sure we will. I think it's a great strategic partnership, and they have a growing portfolio of spirits, and they're building out a spirit, like a standalone spirits business in the US. We have a great team behind us. But I'm sure going forward, there's definitely going to be synergies, and there's going to be ways that we could possibly do different finishings or different spirit collabs, that type of thing. So I think it's great.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So I don't remember. Did we taste the gins? I don't think we did with the LA whiskey.
I don't think we've actually tasted the Pottsville yet, to be honest.
Well, I did. But no, I love this Pottsville, as you can tell.
I love the nose of this because it has this deep citrus wrapped up in some sweetness. It gets me to orange marmalade.
Yeah. It's like a cinnamon, orange, nutmeg,
mapley, leather, clove.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah.
Someone gave me a tasting note on this, and it stuck with me. And it was it tastes like a well-worn and well-worked workshop, like carpenter's workshop that's a little bit dirty, but in the right way.
Oh, that's a great well, let's call it Santa's workshop just to make it much more fun.
Yeah.
Because it's a colder climate in where you come. So, yeah.
Okay.
So I think we're on to cocktails.
Right.
Talk to us. What do you like?
What do I like?
That's what this is about. Tell us what you like. How do you like to see Glendalough cocktailed? And say you walk into a bar and that's not on the menu.
So if that's not on the menu, I love daiquiris.
Wow.
Like I love just like simple daiquiris, and I love gimlets as well.
Mm.
In terms of my stuff, the poitín has a moment and sort of had been having a moment in terms of craft cocktails, because this is like malty, big sort of backbone to it. And it makes a killer pisco sour, replacing pisco for poitín.
Sure.
And it plays beautiful within sours, like New York sours, anything like classic ones with egg white. It plays beautifully in the sour space. So within poitín, I would always look at that. We do have a number of places that will actually use poitín as a base spirit to make their own bitters and tinctures as well.
Nice.
They don't want a neutral grain spirit. They want a spirit with character and weight.
Right.
And a lot of people are sort of using that, which is very cool.
That's awesome.
For in-house bitters, that's wonderful.
For in-house bitters, yeah. So it's having a moment to that. And it's great to use it within cocktails because it has that weight, that malt characteristic. It's a great thing to play off as a base spirit.
Right.
So that can deliver more than a neutral grain, more than the vodka. Very different to a gin. And it's almost that sort of hybrid between a vodka, whiskey, malt, Geneva-y type of thing. So within the craft cocktail, that's where they'd go with it.
Right.
The double barrel, I do like that in the likes of a Gold Rush and some of these sort of lighter cocktails like that.
I could see it in a Gold Rush, sure.
It plays very well within highballs as well, with like your whiskey Collins as well. It sort of plays extremely well within that. Different kettle of fish again, the pot still. This is in whiskey stirred cocktails. Because of the weight of it, I like to do a twist on an old fashioned with this. I know that's an overused cocktail, but incorporate orange bitters and incorporate like chocolate bitters within that as well.
I now know what tonight's cocktail will be.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you, I have recently been fully vaccinated, so I have ventured out of my house, and it's been amazing. Like, there's a local whiskey tavern here called Foreman's Tavern. It's on Foreman in Toluca Lake. I've always loved it, and the one thing about the pandemic, now that we were talking about street seating before, is now they have front seating in the front street, and then they have parking lot in a tent in the back. So when you actually go into the tavern itself, there's very few people. But they had on their menu something called St. Kevin's Fire, which at first I thought was named after a bartender named Kevin, until I found out that the lovely logo you have is of St. Kevin. The ingredients are your double barrel whiskey with St. Elizabeth allspice dram, simple syrup, coffee and cocoa bitters, hickory smoke with a toasted marshmallow.
Oh my God.
And I am going to show you what that looks like.
That is a dessert drink right there, isn't it?
I mean, it's got the little toasted marshmallow.
Oh my God.
They do this wonderful smoking effect after they put everything in, and then they toast the marshmallow and stick it on top.
I would love that as an after dinner drink or next to a fire on a cold day.
It's exactly when I had it. We were sitting outdoors and I had it after our meal there at the tavern, and it was just lovely.
Oh, that's great. When I get back to California, I'll have to come visit.
Yeah, Foreman's a great place.
Nice.
So it was quite tasty. And in fact, I took a friend of mine there for her birthday. And when I saw it on the menu with your whiskey, I said, oh, I have to try this. And I told the bartender, I said, hey, I'm interviewing one of the owners of this whiskey company on next week, so I need to videotape this. And he goes, oh, yeah, by all means, sure. And he's like, that's awesome that you know the owners. And I'm like, yeah, So
I'm kind of a big deal. Yeah, that's what you're like.
I'm kind of a big deal.
They're going to know you at all the whiskey taverns, and they're going to be like, oh yeah, put a couple of those on the comp, you know?
Exactly.
You'll never have to pay for another cocktail.
That's the hope. Anyway, Donald, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us tonight. And all of these expressions are fantastic. The whiskeys, the poitín, the gins.
Well, I actually have a confession to make. This is my first official podcast I've done. I've done like
really
the Facebook Live. I've done radio shows. I've done TV. I've done a lot of stuff like that. but I've never actually done like a sit-down microphone podcast.
Awesome. Okay. Donal, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure having you on the show. Learned a lot more about your tree process, which I was not aware of from the tasting that I went to last time, and a ton more about the gin, which is fantastic. And I can't wait to see how your company progresses. Thank you so much for being here.
That is fantastic. Well, it was an absolute honor, pleasure. This was great fun, or as we say in Ireland, it was great crack. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me on. And yeah, it's a pleasure to share what we've created with this and some of our spirits and our stories. So I just want to thank you both.
Great.
And everyone listening, of course.
Donal has graciously offered a swag bag of goodies for a contest winner. So to see what's in that swag bag, check out spiritsofwhiskey.com for a photo of the goodies and enter to win. World of Wheezy is up next. Stay with us.
Have you heard about Anchor? It's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Hey Louise, nice to have you on this very hot Los Angeles day. It's also a really horrible time for me to be getting a nice summer cold, but luckily I've had some Glendalough Irish whiskey with hot toddies, which has helped keep my throat from burning, and it's also quite delicious in the hot toddy. So we brought you 3 whiskeys, 1 poitín, and 2 gins. Out of all of those lovely expressions, which one did you want to talk to us about pairing and or cooking with today?
I started doing a little bit of reading about Glendalough, and I got very inspired by Saint Kevin and the number 7, the 7 churches, his 7 years spent in the forest there in the Wicklow Mountains. And so it just felt only right to choose the 7-year single malt that also happens to be aged in porter casks. And I'm also a beer lover here. So
Yep.
that spoke to me. And with the notion of foraging and hunting and fishing in that part of Ireland, it just seemed like I needed to make a hunter stew. And depending on where you are, a hunter stew can be different from place to place. And I'm thinking a venison hunter stew is the answer.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, it seems that there are a number of different types of wild deer running around in those parts. And I can only imagine that St. Kevin probably survived off of that, I would guess, at some point, along with some foraged berries and wild herbs and so forth. So that's what I would stick into my stew. I was thinking it would be venison and root vegetables, some wild herbs, fortified with a little bit of the whiskey, maybe a splash of porter thrown in there for good measure.
Nice.
And then I always like to tie in my garden here in LA to everything that I'm cooking.
Of course.
So right now I have this big, beautiful sorrel plant, and it's just so lemony and tart and lovely. And I was thinking it would be a very good chimichurri to add to this particular stew, just to lighten it and brighten it up a little bit.
I'm a big fan of stew, and I'm a big fan of venison, and I'm a big fan of chimichurri. So this sounds totally fantastic, and I can't wait to try it. And I can't wait to share this with Donal to see what he thinks.
I hope he likes my take on it. Not having ever been there, I like to daydream about the fact that I am there when I'm making my pairings, but I'll accept any invite coming my way to visit that part of Ireland.
Absolutely, me too. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today, and we will talk to you next week with our next pairing.
That sounds good. I look forward to it.
For show notes on today's podcast, please visit our website at spiritsofwhiskey.com. That's whiskey with an E.
We'll include links and supporting documents from today's stories in this episode's blog post.
As always, you'll see upcoming topics, a guest roster, and links to past shows.
Sign up to become a VIP member of Spirits of Whiskey. With your membership, you'll have access to various spin-off series, including The Malting Floor, Tales from the Still, and our Telly Award-winning series, Kindred Spirits. To learn how, visit our website and click on the pop-up button. While there, check out our whiskey shop, where you can purchase books from past guests, as well as other whiskey products previously highlighted on the show.
If you run a whiskey club, or if you're a member of one, and you'd like your work featured in the Spirits of Whiskey Club Corner, send us an email via our website contact form, or leave us a voice message on our Anchor page.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time,
Sláinte
Spirits of Whiskey is produced by First Reel Entertainment and the Center for Culinary Culture, home of the Cocktail Collection, and is available via Anchor, Apple, Google, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and wherever fine podcasts are heard.